All right, so you want to get into how the global economic order, really impacts developing countries, right? And what the G77 and China are trying to do about it.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at this pretty in-depth research paper that you sent over the current international economic order, an obstacle to development.
Yes.
It's a bit of a mouthful.
It is.
But don't worry, that's what this whole deep dive is for, right?
Yeah.
To break it down, get to the core arguments without all the heady academic language.
Absolutely, and it's a really critical perspective, especially, when you consider that the G77 in China, they represent, what, more than 130 countries? Like, a significant chunk of the developing world.
Right.
They have a lot to say about how the global economy works or doesn't work.
Yeah, and this paper doesn't mess around.
No.
It straight up says the current system is, rigged against these developing nations, actively holding them back.
Mm.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little.
Okay.
How does it make that case?
So the paper argues that a lot of it goes back to colonialism. Think of it this way. Imagine a race where one runner gets a massive head start, and I mean massive.
Right.
That's kind of the advantage that colonialism gave certain countries, which they then used to set up the global economic order in their favor.
Mm-hmm.
And even though colonialism is quote unquote over, the paper saying those initial advantages, they've been reinforced by things like neoliberal policies.
Right.
So it's kept a lot of developing countries stuck in what they call a status of underdevelopment.
That's of underdevelopment. It's a pretty loaded phrase.
It is.
What are they getting at there?
Yeah, it's important to understand what they mean by that.
Yeah.
They're not just saying these countries are behind in some way, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're arguing that the system itself, the very structure of it, is designed to keep them in a subordinate position.
So it's not about, individual countries needing to just, catch up.
Mm-hmm.
It's about a system that is fundamentally skewed.
Exactly.
Okay, so what's the paper's evidence? What do they point to?
Well, they talk about a few key things.
Okay.
One example, the failure of what's called the New International Economic Order,
Okay.
or NIEO,
Okay.
back in the 1970s.
Okay.
This was a movement led by developing nations to gain more control over their resources, have more of a say in the global economy.
Right.
They had some really ambitious goals, but
But it didn't really pan out.
it didn't pan out.
Why not?
Well, the developed countries, who already held most of the economic and political power, basically shut it down.
Of course.
Right.
Mm.
So it's a perfect example of how the system can be resistant to change, especially when that change threatens the dominance of those already at the top.
Right. It's we're good. We don't need to change anything.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so what does this actually look like in action? What are some of these rigged rules that the paper's talking about?
Well, take international trade agreements as an example.
Okay.
The paper uses the Doha round of trade talks, which started back in 2001.
Okay.
The whole idea was to make global trade fairer for developing countries.
Right.
Sounds good in theory, right?
Right.
But in reality, the negotiations stalled. And many of the issues that developing countries cared about most, like reducing agricultural subsidies in developed countries, never got resolved.
Mm.
These subsidies allow wealthier nations to sell their agricultural products at artificially low prices,
Right.
which, of course, undercuts farmers in developing countries and makes it much harder for them to compete.
Yeah, it's you're being told to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but somebody's yanking at the laces.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just agriculture. This plays out in other industries as well.
And on top of that, you have these transnational corporations, these massive companies operating in multiple countries.
Huge.
The paper argues that they have way too much power,
Oh, yeah.
sometimes even more than actual governments.
Yeah.
How does that impact developing nations?
Well, think about it. If a corporation is bigger than your entire country's economy,
Right.
they have a lot of leverage.
Right.
They can pressure governments to give them tax breaks, to loosen environmental regulations, or even overlook, things like labor exploitation.
Yeah.
And that really undermines a country's ability to control its own resources, to shape its own development path.
So it's not just these historical inequalities.
Right.
It's these very present, very current forces that are still shaping the playing field very unevenly.
Yes.
And speaking of uneven playing fields, debt traps. This is something the paper spends a lot of time on.
Yeah.
What's the gist? What's the main takeaway there?
Essentially, it describes how many developing nations get caught in these cycles of debt, right? borrowing money from richer countries or institutions to finance development projects.
Which, on the surface, sounds like it could make sense, right?
Right, it seems like a solution, but
Right.
it can become a huge problem.
Because then they're constantly having to pay back those loans.
Exactly, and those debt repayments, they can drain resources that could be used for really essential things.
Right.
Like education, healthcare, investing in their own industries.
Yeah.
It's another way that the system can trap them in this cycle of dependency.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is.
This is heavy stuff, to be honest.
It is heavy.
Is there a light at the end of the tunnel?
There is. There is some light at the end of the tunnel.
Okay, good.
The paper doesn't just, like, lay out all the problems, right?
Right.
It also highlights how developing countries are trying to, like, change the game, you know?
Okay, so they're not just, like, taking this lying down.
No, not
Like,
all
what
of
are
it.
they doing to fight back?
They're pushing back on a few different fronts, right? One of their key strategies is this idea of strengthening what's called South-South cooperation.
South-South cooperation. What's
Yes, yeah. So it's basically developing countries teaming up with each other,
Okay.
right? Instead of relying on these traditional power players,
Right.
they're creating their own networks for trade, for sharing technology and resources, for supporting each other's development.
Right. Strength in numbers kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the paper actually points to some regional integration initiatives as a good example of this.
Okay.
We're seeing this happening all over Africa, Latin America, Asia. Countries are forming these economic blocks to kind of boost their collective bargaining power and create their own rules.
So it's like they're building their own, more equitable
Yeah.
system
Yeah.
kind of from the ground up in a way.
Exactly. But it's not just about creating parallel systems.
Right.
They're also targeting the existing system from within.
Okay.
Right? The G77 in China, they're constantly pushing for reforms to these big international institutions
Right.
like the UN, the WTO, the big financial institutions.
Great.
They want a system that gives them a real voice, not just a token seat at the table, you know?
It's about making sure those institutions represent the needs of the majority of the world's population.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And here's a big one challenging the dominance of the US dollar.
Okay, now that's interesting.
Yeah.
Why is that such a big deal?
Because right now, a lot of developing countries, they're just so reliant on the US dollar for trade and finance, right?
Uh-huh.
Which leaves them really vulnerable to any shifts in US economic policy.
Right.
Even if those shifts are actually bad for their own economies.
It's like being stuck on someone else's, financial roller coaster.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the paper talks about, like, exploring alternative reserve currencies, maybe boosting the use of regional currencies,
Right.
even looking at the potential of, like, digital currencies.
Ah.
It's about trying to create a more diversified
Right.
and, more democratic financial system.
So more options, less dependence on one single power.
Exactly.
What else are they doing?
Well, a lot of it has to do with trying to, take control of their own economic destinies.
Right.
Diversification is a big one.
Uh,
A lot of developing countries have historically been really reliant on exporting just a small number of raw materials, right?
Mhm.
Like agricultural products or minerals.
Which is risky, right?
It's incredibly risky because if the price of their main export crashes, their whole economy takes a hit.
Right.
So they're looking at ways to diversify their economies, invest in a broader range of industries, developing local manufacturing.
Right. So not just supplying the raw materials, but actually turning them into higher value products themselves.
Exactly.
Okay.
This helps them build more resilient economies
Makes sense.
that are less susceptible to these global market swings.
Right.
And this ties into another strategy the paper highlights, which is strategic industrial policies.
What does that mean?
So it basically means that governments are actively supporting key industries, right?
Okay.
That have the potential to drive economic growth, to create jobs.
Right.
This could involve things like providing subsidies, investing in research and development, maybe even temporarily protecting young industries from foreign competition, at least until they're strong enough to stand on their own.
So it's about being more strategic, not just leaving everything to just the whims of the free market.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that developing countries might need to use different tools to kind of catch up and level the playing field.
Right. They're playing a different game. They need different rules.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this challenges the traditional kind of one-size-fits-all approach to economic development, which has often been pushed by wealthier nations.
Right. Like what worked for us will work for you. But it's not the same.
Exactly. It's about finding what works best for them,
Right.
not just following someone else's playbook.
Their own path, yeah.
Exactly. And along with all of this, the paper also emphasizes the importance of social safety nets.
Okay, like what?
Things like unemployment insurance, food assistance programs,
Yeah.
universal health care.
So making sure that while they're restructuring their economies, they're also still taking care of, like, the most vulnerable people.
Yes, absolutely. It's about recognizing that true development isn't just about boosting GDP, right?
Right.
It's about actually improving the well-being of all citizens.
Like the human side of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, so we've talked about some of the ways that developing countries are kind of fighting back, but the paper also spends a lot of time on this issue of trade agreements and how tricky that whole thing is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
What's the main takeaway there?
Well, the paper argues that the current system of global trade, which is largely governed by the World Trade Organization, the WTO,
Right.
often works against the interests of developing countries.
How so?
Well, for one, the way that the WTO is structured often gives more weight to the concerns of developed countries.
Right.
They have more power within that system. And on top of that, you have things like, we talked about earlier, the agricultural subsidies in developed countries.
Right, where they can just flood the market with cheap products.
Exactly. And then you have these so-called free trade agreements, right, that are often negotiated between developed and developing countries. And, they sound good on paper.
Right.
But often contain provisions that actually limit the ability of developing countries to protect their own industries or prioritize, social and environmental goals.
So it's like a bait and switch.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Promising free trade, but then imposing all these restrictions that actually end up benefiting the more powerful countries.
Right.
And this isn't just about economics, it's about power, right?
Oh, yeah.
Trade agreements can be used to influence everything from intellectual property laws to environmental regulations to labor standards.
There's a lot of power.
Yeah.
So what can developing countries do about that? Like, how do they fight back against that?
Well, the paper suggests a few things. One is to push for reform of the WTO itself, right? Trying to make it a more democratic and equitable institution.
Right.
Another is to explore alternative trade arrangements. Like, we talked about strengthening those regional trade blocs.
Right.
Or even creating new agreements that prioritize things like fair trade practices and sustainable development.
To get, like, diversifying their options, not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then I think crucially, the paper really emphasizes the importance of what they call capacity building.
What does that mean in this context?
It basically means making sure that developing countries have the expertise and the resources they need to effectively negotiate these trade agreements, to monitor how they're being implemented,
Right.
to make sure that they're actually delivering on their promises.
It's like, giving them the tools
Yeah.
to actually play the game effectively.
Exactly. Empowering them to be like savvy negotiators,
Right.
and advocates for their own interests.
Okay, so, wow. We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From the kind of historical roots of this inequality in the global economic order to the very real challenges
Yeah.
developing countries are facing, even today, but also I think some really inspiring ways that they're fighting back
Absolutely.
and trying to create, a system that actually works for everyone.
Yeah.
One of the, I think, most striking points that the paper makes is this whole thing about global priorities.
Yes.
Okay, so tell me more about that.
So they highlight these just massive sums of money that are spent globally on things like, advertising the military. We're talking like trillions and trillions of dollars.
Yeah, and I'm guessing they're contrasting that with, how much is spent on things like development aid, poverty alleviation.
Exactly. And the discrepancy it's pretty shocking, honestly.
Yeah, I bet.
It makes you really think about where our collective priorities actually lie.
Right, it's like we're so busy, pouring resources into maintaining a system.
Yeah.
That even if that system is, deeply unequal, that seems to be the priority, as opposed to actually, like, investing in solutions that could create a more, just and sustainable world for everybody.
Right. And it's not just about, governments and institutions. It's about all of us as individuals, right?
What do you mean?
Like every time we buy a product, support a company, cast a vote.
We're making a choice.
We're participating in the system.
Yeah.
Our choices have ripple effects.
So it's about being more conscious consumers.
Yes.
More informed citizens,
Hmm.
really thinking about, like, what kind of world are we trying to build?
Exactly, exactly. And I think that's what makes this paper so powerful, right?
Yeah.
It's not just an academic exercise.
Right.
It's a call to action.
It is. So as we kind of, wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what's the key takeaway? What can our listener do?
I think the most important thing is just to remember that we're not powerless, right?
Right.
We all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world,
Okay.
whether that's through our everyday choices, our political engagement, supporting organizations that are on the front lines of these issues. Every action counts.
So it's about staying informed, staying engaged,
Yes.
and never underestimating, our power, our collective power to make a difference.
I love that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for diving deep with us.
Thank you.
Until next time.